Hello everyone, so today I'll be looking at Schaffer's stages of attachment. I am following along with the AQA Psychology textbook for A Level Year 1 and AS with the green haired girl on. So the things you need to know and be able to recognise, your specification point is stages of attachment as identified by Schaffer, multiple attachments. So you need to know at what age each stage of attachment is. And you also need to know what stages of attachment are and what multiple attachments are. So we've got this key study at the top of your page, which is by Schaffer and Emerson. So their aim was to investigate the formation of early attachments. So they were looking at what age that attachment develops and their emotional intensity and to whom their attachment is directed towards. So they conducted a study with 60 babies, so it is a relatively small sample size, and we've only got 31 males and 29 females in terms of female babies and male babies. They're all from Glasgow, so we can see that the population validity is going to be low, and they're all from like the same working background, so it's skilled working class. Researchers, they asked the mothers questions about the kind of protest that the babies showed in everyday situations. So for example, if the adult left the room, the mother was asked about that and she had to report back to the researchers, Schaffer and Emerson, about what the baby showed. What sort of interactions was the baby showing? Was the baby crying when an adult left the room? Sort of things like that. The researchers also asked about stranger anxiety, so that was how the infant reacts to an unfamiliar adult. And the babies and their mothers were visited at home every month for the first year and again at 18 months. And now between the weeks 25 and 32, about 50% of the babies showed signs of separation anxiety towards a particular adult, and that particular adult was usually the mother. By 40 weeks, 80% of the babies had a specific attachment and almost 30% displayed multiple attachments. In 65% of infants, the first attachment was to the mother. In 3% of infants, the attachment in terms of the first one was to the father. 35% formed simultaneous attachments to two people, so their attachments formed at the exact same time. So therefore, specific attachment doesn't have to be just one person, it can be two, as we can see that 35% are attaching to two people. Okay, so what is a multiple attachment? This is an attachment to two or more people, and most babies appear to develop multiple attachments once they have formed one true attachment to a main caregiver. So once they've formed a specific one, they then go on to develop multiple, and that's what happens in most cases. So I've jumped over to the AO3 here for this specific study. So we've got good external validity. So this is a strength of their study. Schaffer and Emerson's study was carried out in families' own homes, so it's a very naturalistic study that was carried out in the homes of the families, so the babies were in their own natural environment. They didn't have to go over to a lab. So most observation was done by the parents in normal activities. We weren't having to create, the researchers weren't having to create any sort of activity. It was all with their own toys kind of thing. So it was later reported to the researchers by the mother or the father. So stranger anxiety was investigated by the researchers themselves. So when they came in and observed the infant, they were strangers, so they could observe that particular aspect themselves. So it means the behaviour of babies was unlikely to be affected by the presence of others as they were doing this ordinary activity because they were in that familiar environment. So it's a high chance that the participants behaved naturally whilst they were being observed. So therefore we can argue it's got high external validity. A further strength is that it is a longitudinal design. What we mean by this is the same children were observed and followed up regularly. We know this because the researchers were going in monthly to the families' homes to observe the children. An alternative method, which would have been much easier, a quicker method, would have been to use a cross-sectional design. So that's when you have two different groups almost. So you have certain age children there and you observe them, and then you observe different children at different ages and compare them. That would have been a quicker way, but longitudinal designs have better internal validity, and that was what was used here, as the same individual is being studied. And longitudinal designs do not have the confounding variable of individual differences between participants. So there's no participant variables that differ because you're investigating these same children. However, a limitation is that there are limited sample characteristics. So there are 60 babies, which is good because we've got a huge amount of data gathered on each participant. But the problem that we've got is that the participants were all from the same district, the same social class, the same city, and it was over 50 years ago. So this is a limitation. And this is limited because child rearing practices, they vary from one culture to another and from one historical period to another. So the results do not generalize well to other social and historical contexts. So we can argue also that there is a lack of temporal validity as it was done over 50 years ago. Now we'll look at the stages of attachment. So these were put forward by Schaffer and Emerson because they proposed that based on their research. So there's 4 stages, and our first stage is the asocial stage. Now this happens between 0 to 6 weeks. So babies in this stage produce similar responses to objects and people, and they do not prefer specific people to others. So they don't show a preference. They do show some preference, however, to familiar adults in that those individuals find it easier to calm them. Babies are also happier in the presence of other humans, and they quickly learn to differentiate between familiar and unfamiliar people by smell and voice. The second stage is indiscriminate attachment. So this is between 6 weeks and 6 months. So the babies become much more sociable in this stage. They can tell people apart and prefer human company. They can be comforted by anyone and do not prefer specific individuals yet. So indiscriminate, in this sense, they are not bothered of who it is, but they just prefer to be comforted by humans, other humans. So they don't fear strangers here, and their attachment is indiscriminate because it's not different towards any one person. It is the same to everyone. The third stage of attachment is specific attachment. So this happens from 7 months onwards, and this is discriminate in the sense that it's not the same to all adults. So an infant begins to show separation anxiety, protesting when their primary attachment figure leaves them. So that's an example of the sort of behaviour you would see with separation anxiety. They avoid unfamiliar people and protest if strangers try to handle them. So that's examples of stranger anxiety. And this is where a primary attachment is formed. So there's 3 different types according to Ainsworth. So there's secure, insecure, resistant, and insecure, avoidant. And Bowlby suggests that the first attachment should be monotropic. It should be a secure attachment because that secure attachment is your template for future relationships. So you want it to be secure because that's where an infant will show moderate distress to the different anxieties and won't be overly clingy or overly trying to avoid an adult. Your fourth stage is multiple attachments. This happens from 10 to 11 months. The infant begins to show attachment behaviour towards several different people. So this includes your siblings, grandparents, and childminders. In Schaffer and Emerson study, 29% of the children had secondary attachments within a month of forming a primary, so that's your specific attachment. And by 1 year, the majority had developed multiple attachments. So if we have a look at your evaluation, you have 4 different points here for the stages. There is a problem studying the asocial stage. So this is a limitation. Important interactions are taking place during this asocial stage. But the problem is that babies have poor coordination and are generally immobile. So we don't see too much of the interactions because it can be hard to pick up on. So if you're studying an infant, they might just sleep for the entire time that you're observing them, and we don't see the interaction. So it can be difficult, therefore, to make judgments about them based on the observations of their behaviour. So there isn't really that much to observe because they're either sleeping or they might be being fed. So it doesn't mean that the child's feelings are not highly social in this stage, but the evidence is very limited and it cannot be relied on therefore. A further limitation is conflicting evidence on multiple attachments. So it's not exactly clear when children become capable of having these multiple attachments. Some research suggests that most, if not all, infants form an attachment to a single main carer before they become capable of developing multiple attachments. So that's what Bowlby argues. But in Schaffer and Emerson's study, fathers were first joint attachment figure in 35% of infants. So the father is important, but these results are different in terms of what they found in their research. And then we've got other researchers which believe babies form multiple attachments from the outset, so Van Eysendorn. So we've got quite a lot of conflicting evidence on multiple attachments. This is a limitation. A further limitation is measuring multiple attachment. So we have a great difficulty here in terms of measuring multiple attachments. So just because an infant shows distress when an individual leaves the room, it doesn't mean that the individual is a true attachment figure. So if you think of the setup of a child playing with another child, so they've got a playmate with them, if they leave the room, the child left in the room may get distressed. But that does not signify attachment. So this is a problem for Schaffer and Emerson stages because their observation doesn't leave us with a way to distinguish between behaviour shown to secondary attachment figures, so that's like brothers and grandparents, and then that shown towards playmates. A final limitation is that Schaffer and Emerson used limited behavioural measures of attachment. So they were using separation anxiety and stranger anxiety to define attachment. And some critics believe that these two measures are too simple. But separation and stranger anxiety are easy to observe, so it makes it possible to be objective in our judgments of attachment. So there's this thing called inter-rater reliability, which is where you have two or more observers observing behaviour, and what they should be able to do is agree on the attachment status of any child from when they observe them, because they're using objective behavioural categories. So it can be argued, however, that attachment is more complex though than just two behaviours, so it may be that the measures are not that valid. So I've had a look through the past papers. This is from a Specimen set 1, A Level paper 1. So it says name 3 stages in the development of attachments identified by Schaffer. So this is quite a simple question. You just need to name 3 of those stages that we've looked at for 3 marks. So here's your mark scheme. It's just got the 3 different ones that you can use. You don't need to be writing this in a sentence. If you have a question that starts with name, it will literally want 1 or 2 words depending on what it's asking for. It will not need you to write sentences. I've also found this question from an A-Level paper 1 from June 2017. So it says name 3 of the stages of attachment identified by Schaffer. Very similar to the question we just looked at, 3 marks. Okay, so here is your mark scheme. You can see it's all AO1 marks. It says name at the start, so it just wants you to literally write 3 things, as I was saying. 1 mark for each of any of those 3. I think something to think about with this spread is that it's not really been questioned that much. All that's ever come up is just name the stages. So I think be really prepared for this because it's something that's not really been tested that much. So I would recommend getting an essay plan definitely prepared for this spread particularly. Okay, thank you for listening and best of luck with the rest of your revision.